Ladies and gentlemen, next up we have an interview with Andrew Chaikin, a man on the moon, the Voyages of the Apollo astronauts. That's the title. Andrew is the author of the book Man on the Moon, the Apollo Program, released recently by Astra Publishing House, 2021. It's as fresh as it gets, apparently. Andrew had the opportunity to meet astronauts and people whose passion and persistence led to the first human landing on the moon. The discussion will be moderated by Mateusz Józefowicz. Mateusz, over to you. Enjoy.
So once again, thank you very much for accepting the invitation. Great to have you with us at this event on the Lunar Day, and we are going to talk about the lunar book and the lunar adventure that actually it reveals. I had the honor to be translator on the book, so I've already went through this adventure, and I thank you. It's really a voyage, and this is what the title is about. So this is the Voyages of the Apollo astronauts, a man on the moon, and this is a history of Apollo program. And my first question is actually, what is space history? Space exploration is considered a thing of the future or a thing of the present. So what does it mean to be a space historian, and is it really a closed chapter? Should we consider this as a closed chapter?
Wow. Well, so, you know, it's a great question for me personally, because when I was growing up and I was completely caught up in the space program and so excited to see humans going into space when I was young. And then I was in junior high school when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin made the first moon landing and the first moonwalk. And I was in high school by the time the Apollo missions ended. And I had no idea that there were people called space historians. I never dreamed that I would become a space historian. But really, space exploration is like any other aspect of human activity. We want to know what happened. Those of us, most of us who are not involved, want some way to share the experience. And one of the ways that we get to share the experience is because of historians who go in and talk to the people involved, talk to the people who actually do it, and find out what happened, why it happened, what it was like, that all of those questions that we would have being curious people. So I did that for Apollo. I did that specifically for the astronauts. I wanted to know, what was it like to go to the moon? You know, what do you see? What do you feel? What do you think when you're standing on the surface of another world? And what do you think about when you come back and you see the moon in the sky? And those were the questions that were in my mind when I started writing the book. Space history, though, is something that is continuing even today. I mean, look at what's happening today. NASA is getting ready to send humans back to the moon with a project called Artemis. And you probably have heard of Elon Musk, who has a company called SpaceX and is doing amazing things with his rockets and spacecraft. So, and then there's the whole field of robotic exploration, the Mars rover Perseverance and the Ingenuity helicopter and all of the other robotic missions that are exploring the solar system. So space history is something that is ongoing, and that we will never run out of stories to tell.
You had a chance to meet the astronauts and actually to know them very well, both from personal conversations and from studying the material that they produced and they left. There is a whole archives of the material that was produced by the missions. During those conversations and during getting those people closer, do you think that they are willing to share this experience and are they getting very technical? Are they rather like cold technical guys, or do they get emotional? Because it is, I guess, it's a very emotional experience to go to space at all. How do they perceive it after all those years, do those memories still remain vivid in them, or do they just go on to other tasks? Is there a life after the moon for them?
Yeah, it's a great question. It really depends on the person. Some of the astronauts were more technically oriented and not emotionally oriented. Others were more emotionally oriented. In general, I would say that they really experienced going to the moon as professionals. So, you know, whatever you do for a living, imagine doing it at the absolute, you know, top of your profession, at the absolute hardest, most important aspect of your profession. Imagine having a mission to do, and imagine that not only your own country, imagine that it was a matter of national prestige for your country, but imagine also that the entire world was watching on live TV. And you can begin to understand what that experience was. It actually took a little while for me to understand it, because I was coming to it as somebody who had been on the outside and thought, God, that's an incredible experience. It must just be a complete, overwhelming, you know, emotional, you know, intellectual, and every other way it must be overwhelming. But it wasn't, because they were so focused on the job, and they were so trained, they were so well trained, they were so mentally prepared for everything that they did. Now, that is the general observation that I would make. But within that, they had many experiences that they had very interesting and vivid reactions to. The reaction to seeing the Earth become so small as they went away from it. You know, the moon is about 240,000 miles away from the Earth. And so when you get out that far, the Earth is so small that you can literally cover it behind your outstretched thumb. And, you know, it doesn't matter how much training you've done, nothing really prepares you for that. And they talked about that as something that had a great impact on them. Not necessarily that it changed them. Very few said that it really changed them, just a couple. Most of them talked about it as a change in perspective. And, you know, by the time I got to them, it had been, about 15 years, some cases more like 20 years since their flights. I would say the memories were still pretty vivid. And even today, all these years later, you know, more than half a century, they still have the memories. They still talk about it, the ones who are still with us. So there are many, many dimensions to the moon experience. And that's one of the reasons why it took me so long. It took 8 years for me to write the book.
Yeah, so was it actually difficult to get to all the intrinsics and all the materials related to the Apollo program? Well, from one perspective, this was a classified matter and strategic matter. On the other hand, it was transparent. How was it nowadays?
Not classified, not at all. There was a very clear boundary in the United States between the NASA program, which was called the civilian space program and still is, versus the military space programs. So no, nothing was classified. There were some things that were held back for many years, and that really was just the recordings that were made in the spacecraft when the astronauts were on the far side of the moon, outside of radio contact with Earth. There was a tape recorder in the spacecraft that was recording their conversations, and those were kept confidential. Was the rating on it, not classified but confidential, by NASA until the early 1980s. So my timing was perfect, because when I came along to do my book, beginning in about 1985, those tapes had become released. The transcripts were all available. And in general, I had no trouble getting the information I needed from NASA, all the transcripts of the missions, the communications between the astronauts and mission control, all of their debriefings that they gave when they came back from the missions about each phase of the mission. I was able to get copies of the video that they sent down from the flights, all of these things. So the hardest part was getting the astronauts who were now, had moved on to other parts of their lives. The hard part was getting them to agree to talk to me. Some of them were easier than others, but again, that's one of the reasons why it took me 8 years. I had to convince them that I had really done my homework, so to speak, and I had really prepared at my end for the interviews that I wanted to conduct. And I think in the end, they were very happy with the process of my interviewing them.
Do you think that they are still on the mission of spreading the, like Mike Collins, carrying the fire? And so do they still willingly share this experience in order to encourage the new generation, or is it you said that you had some were easier to talk to and some were more reluctant? Why do you think is that? Is it just a personal issue?
Yeah, it's just the personalities, and even today there are some who are easier to. They will agree more easily to talk about Apollo, and some are less interested in doing it. I think at this point in their lives today, they're in their 80s and their 90s now. It's really a question of, they just don't want to give any more energy to it. But, for most of the time since Apollo, I would say that the majority of the astronauts were pretty much willing to talk about it. And there were just a few that were more reluctant. Neil Armstrong, for example, was a very private man and did not really enjoy the process of being interviewed in general. I think he enjoyed my interview with him, and I've certainly seen videos in later years that seemed like he was having a good time, but he was very selective about who he talked to. It just wasn't the place he wanted to put his time and energy. So it really does just depend on the person.
Actually, I have to tell to the Polish audience that this book is the first one published in Poland that covers actually the whole program and whole missions, because we know very well Apollo 11 and we know some other missions also quite well, including Apollo 13, so the successes and failures. But actually, this book covers whole program up to Apollo 17, and each subsequent mission was more and more interesting. And actually, this is not what we are really aware of. We really focus that the Apollo 11 was the iconic landmark, and what happens later, actually, there was no much information in Polish unless somebody wanted to dig into archives on their own and some studies. But this is for the Polish audience the first chance to really get to know the details of all those wonderful missions, and wonderful things were actually being carried out later. I have my favorite missions there. Do you find any of those missions particularly important, or do you have a favorite one? Do you think that they somehow went to some kind of climax, or should we continue? Is it a pity that they were actually abandoned after the 17th? There were plans for 18th and 20th.
Right. There were 3 Apollo missions that were canceled, and that was a shame. I mean, the moon is a spectacular place. It's scientifically, it's a absolute, I mean, scientifically, the moon is one of the most valuable places that we have in the solar system, because we can go to the moon and we can look back through the rocks on the moon and studying the surface of the moon, we can go back to the earliest history of our part of the solar system. And we can understand what happened in the very first period of time, just the first few 100 million years after the Earth and the moon were formed. And that may give us clues to the conditions that gave rise to life on the Earth. I mean, there's so much that we have yet to understand about the moon. And that's one of the reasons I'm glad that we're going back. It's also, as you will see from the book, a spectacular human experience, just the experience of standing on the moon on this, there's no air. The sky is completely black. The sunlight, however, is extremely intense. And the astronauts all said it was a beautiful place to be, not only on the surface, but orbiting the moon and looking down at the moon from orbit. There's so much richness there. The experience of seeing the Earth as a beautiful oasis. They called it an oasis in space. The only color that you see, apart from the gray and tan colors of the moon itself, is this beautiful blue and white planet that hangs in the sky. That's what I tried to put into the book, along with the details of what the astronauts did. You asked me if I have a favorite mission or several favorites. Certainly Apollo 8, which was the first flight to the moon. It was the first time humans went out of low Earth orbit and went all the way out to the moon, and they actually went into orbit around the moon. That story, I think, is one of the most exciting stories from a human standpoint. And that's one of the ones that I enjoyed writing the most. But I really did get something to enjoy in every single one of the missions. I mean, telling those stories is a fabulous experience. The experience of landing on the moon for the first time in human history, as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin did on Apollo 11. 50 years ago this summer was Apollo 15, which was the first mission with the lunar rover, the battery-powered car that took the astronauts across the surface, and they actually went up the sides of lunar mountains. They went to the edge of a giant canyon, and that was an amazing mission to write about. Every single one of them had something amazing, something remarkable, something unforgettable.
So, for you personally, was it just a research, or was it also an adventure?
Oh, it was a very, very deeply meaningful, personal voyage for me, because I had grown up with Apollo. It had been the most important thing in my life. I was absolutely, you could say I was obsessed with wanting to understand what that experience was like. And of course, the astronauts were all my heroes when I was growing up. So the chance to sit down with them and ask them these questions and talk to them at great length about their experiences and their thoughts and their feelings about it was just really one of the great experiences of my entire life.
Well, geology is very strong at the ERC because you've mentioned robotics. There is just behind the big wall here is a Mars yard built with robots that compete, and there are engineers, but there are also geologists who analyze samples those robots dig out. We actually hosted Harrison Schmidt in 2015 here, so geology is a big thing, and I really also enjoyed the fact that the book was not written only from the engineering perspective or human factor perspective, but also there was a lot about the environment, the geology of the moon. Well,
that was my training. You know, I mean, before I became a writer, I was trained in geology, and my goal before I got into writing, I thought I was going to be a planetary geologist. So actually, when I started writing A Man on the Moon, even before I talked to the astronauts, I already knew some of the geologists who had worked on the missions, and they were some of the first people I talked to in writing the book.
Yeah, and when you read the book, you can tell that there is a really big focus on the why should we go to the moon, because it's very interesting in terms of science, but it's also an environment to explore. Who is the book for actually? Is it for enthusiasts of space program, or should an audience look? Wider audience should take it also?
I wrote the book for everyone. I wanted anyone to be able to pick up the book and understand what they were reading. Even the technology, I worked very hard to explain the technology, explain the methods that they use to get to the moon, to land on the moon. I spent a lot of time explaining the moon landing, how it happened, for example. I explained the science. I mean, that was my that had become my profession at that point, because a few years before I started writing A Man on the Moon, I was an editor at Sky and Telescope magazine writing about astronomy, and I started writing for other magazines as well about space exploration and astronomy for the general public. So everything I put into the book is meant for anybody to pick up and read.
Well, thank you very much, Andy. Our launch window is closing, but we have launched successfully, and we have launched in Poland under the title Człowiek na Księżycu, program Apollo, released by wydawnictwo Astra, wydawnictwo _astra.pl. We encourage everybody to actually get onto this voyage. It's a great adventure, and thank you once again for speaking to us and taking the invitation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for doing such a great job in translating my book. I'm so glad that the people in Poland can share the adventure.
It was a pleasure.